What is going on, investors? Hopefully, you guys are doing well out there. Time for the Equity Empire Podcast Emergency Special. We've got Trump's Trade War 2.0 unfolding in the markets. During the market trade today, and a little mixed market action. You had that false report, or at least that was deemed false, that it looked like President Trump wanted to do a pause, or at least that was the report, maybe a 90-day pause on all of these tariffs that he's announced dating back to last week. You guys probably tuned into the live stream and obviously have felt and seen the fallout in the markets since then. Mixed day on Wall Street after the report that the 90-day pause was likely a false report. Little mixed bag on markets. You know, you have companies like Meta, Nvidia up higher, Amazon, surprisingly enough, also up. Some of the major banks, which report later this week on Friday, also seeing shares higher, but you had shares like Tesla, Microsoft, and Apple slip lower. We'll discuss all of that on today's show. We'll also talk about China, talk about what's going on over there, some of the economic impacts and some of the policies that China has been put in place, and how Trump could potentially back them in a corner. We'll answer some questions as well that came across after I posted a newsletter. This came across last night. So on Sunday night, I was thinking about this all weekend, thinking about the president as somebody that, you know, I've followed his career in business and now followed him through his second administration here in the United States as a president. And the question I had was on this tariff thing is who was going to blink first? You obviously have the United States under the pressure of stocks massively declining, having some of the biggest declines that we've really ever seen. Could that put the president in a tight spot? Could he be forced to put a 90-day pause or roll back the policies that he rolled out on Liberation Day on April 2nd? Could the market pressures and the downward decline, could that cause him to blink first and say, you know what, China, instead of 54% tariffs, we're doing something else? Hey, you know what, EU, instead of doing this, we're going to do that. In Vietnam and Taiwan and all these other countries, kind of down the line. My read on this, and this dates back again before today's, I don't think he would have had that big Liberation Day, April 2nd, trumpets and, you know, backslapping and those types of things. Now, I don't think that would have happened if he wanted to turn around a week later and reverse his decision or delay his decision. I think this man has his mind made up. He is going to dig his heels in. And that really puts two countries or two regions in particular in a tight spot. Obviously, China and obviously the European Union or the EU. Both of those countries have major relations as it relates to the United States. A lot of consumers here in the United States buy their stuff to a lesser degree. Americans make stuff here in America and export it to those nations. How are those nations going to react? And we've got actually reaction from both of them, including the EU. But a couple of things to start off with is, you know, when I post things about politics, about Trump, about economics, some of you just are not going to be able to handle it. And I think these markets where you're having big up days and down days, it can be stressful on a lot of you. And I understand that. And then you're weaving in Trump, and some of you either really like Trump or don't like him, or you're somewhere in between on him. And so these things create a lot of emotions. And that is what I am trying to get across. When we write long articles about this, I give it a lot of thought. And I give it a lot of thought about what the conclusion needs to be. Because you guys are all seeing all the news out there. You're seeing all the stuff happening. You're seeing your stock portfolios absolutely got decimated over the past couple of days. So the decisions have to start to be made. And I would say some of you just are not ready to do that. So we lost some subscribers today, but as of today, when I'm looking at the stats of this newsletter, it's actually our most viewed newsletter. It also contributed to the most new subscribers. And so we're going to lose some of you across this journey. And for some of you, I would say that this journey should probably be your end to picking individual stocks. That's not a message that you're going to see a lot on podcasts or YouTube or in newsletters. Everybody wants to make you feel good and wants to pump you up. But the cold, hard truth is many of you are just simply not ready to analyze stocks from an objective perspective. And it comes clear to me as I'm looking across social media that there's Bill Ackman is probably the quintessential guy, but then you've got everybody else trying to be like Bill Ackman. Everybody is trying to tell the president, hey, you should do it like this. You should do the tariffs like this. You should have rolled it out like this. You should have said this. You should have not have posted yourself teeing off and playing golf on True Social. You should do it like this. The 10 years this. There's all these thoughts going through your guys' minds. And all I want to emphasize and this is what the rest of this podcast is going to be about. We can't control what Donald Trump says or even what he does. We have no control over that. The election is over. He has been elected and he is able to do the things that he wants to do, or at least attempt to do, while he's in office. There's no reason for us as investors to sit here and say, hey, the tariff should have been placed on like this, or he should have called Vietnam, or he should have called the EU, or he should have only done it on this group of goods. We don't have that decision-making power. It is a complete waste of time, a complete waste of energy. It's just a complete waste of your time on this earth. As the earth is rotating around the sun, you are wasting your time, wasting the rotations that the earth makes, trying to focus on what the president should say or what he should do. I got so much feedback today on Twitter, on my now blog post and newsletter of people saying, well, Trump should have done this. He should do this. He should do this. You're not the president. As an investor, you have to stay focused on what you can control. And you can control what you believe the outcome is going to be. You can digest what Trump is saying. You can digest what President Xi in China is saying. You can digest what Vietnam and Israel and some of these other countries, Taiwan, have indicated how they want to go forward and proceed in this negotiation. You can consume all of that information. I don't need to be sitting here and telling President Xi of China what he needs to be doing, just like I don't need to be doing that to President Trump. As an investor, you want to focus on the outcome. The outcome is what gets you paid. What Trump says or does in the meantime is not going to get you paid. In fact, it's probably a big waste of time. Now, Trump today came out. There was many people believing that maybe he would take a step back on these tariffs. He would see the dramatic drop in these markets and he would be spooked, and the recession fears and all those types of things. His base and the farmlands or the working class guy would all of a sudden be spooked by the stock market. But here's the thing, guys, is go actually hang out. Get off of Twitter. Get off of any social media platform. And go hang out with somebody, a working class guy. Go hang out with a guy that has a 9-to-5 job, that is getting paid by the hour, that is going to the grocery store and seeing higher prices, goes to the gas station, fills up the tank, and for the past couple of years, it continues to go higher and higher. And they're in a completely different universe than the vast majority of X or Twitter or any of your affluent friends out there. In fact, the stat I see is that I believe it's something like 50% of America, it might even be higher these days, about half of America can't afford a $2,000 emergency expense. You can go, pause the podcast, pause the video, and go look up that stat. Most of America can't even afford a $2,000, guys, a $2,000 emergency expense. So you need to put yourself in that frame of mind. Also, a significant, way more than you think, way more people in the United States don't even have a bank account. Most of America can't afford a $2,000 expense. Most of America can't even afford or even have a bank account. When you go out during your daily trips, now some of you watching this and listening to this, you might live in super affluent areas, okay? You live in some of these affluent areas out here in California or in Florida or New York, and I've been to these places. and you're in a bubble. You go to Whole Foods or you go to that expensive supermarket where everything, the cereal boxes are $9. I still go, even though the price of eggs have come down, I go to the grocery store around the corner. It's not a cheap grocery store. The eggs are still like $10 or $12, a dozen. Okay. They can get away with that. Meat is still there's like $45 a pound steaks that they sell, and they sell. Okay. What you have to do is take a step out of your bubble and walk around the Costco or go to Walmart and walk around and look at those people. That is the vast majority of people out there. You walk into a Walmart, none of those people have a stock account. And if they do, maybe it's a couple $1,000. And so, yeah, maybe over the past week, it's down 20, 30, 40%. But to that person, they weren't going to sell that stock account. They probably don't even know how to log into it. Okay. And so the vast majority of people are struggling. Scott Bessent, which is, I believe, the Treasury Secretary, he was on an interview. I can't remember who it was, but he said over this past year, Americans took more European vacations. This is probably led primarily by boomers, by retirees, people who have retired and earned their wealth and by all means deserve to take a European vacation. But at the same time, more Americans are buying food at food banks. So we have a mass wealth discrepancy. So whenever you start looking at the stock market, start looking at these economic policies, and yeah, it impacts you because you're listening to this. You have a Robinhood account. You have a Schwab account. You have a 401k. You have a job. You have employer match in your 401k and those types of things. But just understand, half the country doesn't have that. Half the country isn't in your shoes. It just isn't, okay? And if we want to stretch this out to the entire world, 8 out of 10 people in the entire world don't even know what that is, okay? Let alone have a roof over their head. And then we have to think about America as well. Got to think about not the baby boomers with all this money, not somebody that's working at Google or one of these professional jobs making $150,000, $200,000 a year and they're living relatively comfortable. What you have to think about is that young kid coming up. He's got student loan debt. He hasn't even bought his first really nice car. He hasn't even bought a house. Okay, so think about like the young millennial or the next generation that's coming up. They haven't even landed their house. They can't even afford a house, okay? So they haven't even gotten into home ownership. They haven't even bought their first European car or their first Tesla or whatever, okay? So stocks are not even on the radar of those people because they haven't even bought a house yet. And so we need to frame our economic, like so many people look at things through the lens of themselves and their privilege. And the bottom line is stocks going down, particularly, I mean, this is performance for the day, but if you want to stretch out performance any length of time, this is a year's performance. Just in the top S&P 500 stocks, many stocks are still up over the past year, including Netflix up 38%, Nvidia up 12%, Apple up 7%, JP Morgan up 9%, AbbVie up 11%. So there are stocks that are still performing well. Tesla is up 38% over the past year. Yes, year to date, pretty much the entire stock market is red outside of a handful of stocks. But if you've been investing for any length of time, red on the screen is no big deal. And then in the context of the human population, most people don't own a house. Most people can't afford a $2,000 expense. Those people don't care if your stocks are going down. So keep that in mind if you're going to whine and cry about what the president is doing. And he did not take a step back today. In fact, I believe he took a step forward. And when I published my newsletter on Sunday night, I said right at the top, in fact, right underneath the title of Who Blinks First, that Trump is going to dig his heels in. He is going to dig his heels in, and he's going to put the EU and he's going to put China in a box and on an island. And which direction do China and the EU want to go? Do they want access to the United States market and sell to our consumers, or do they not want that? And that's a decision those countries have to make. And America, and this is what got some people in a little bit of a tizzy, is that America has the F-18s. We have the aircraft carriers. We have the nuclear bombs. And we have a consumer that is trained to overspend. Whether you're on the low end or certainly the high end, you're trained to rack up that credit card bill. You're trained to go on that vacation so you can snap a couple of selfies and post it on your Instagram feed. That's the American way. In China, which we'll get to here in a bit, it's completely different. The consumer there is trained to hunker down and not overspend and, be really more conservative from their spending perspective. The American consumer is the best. And we could sit here and argue and say, well, if people cannot afford a $2,000 expense, why do they have an iPhone? Again, we can't control that. We can't control what people spend on. We could only focus on the outcome. The outcome is in the United States, most people have a $1,000 cell phone, but also a good portion of people couldn't even afford a $1,000 medical emergency or a car accident or anything. Hopefully it's not too serious, but any kind of bill, maybe, your plumbing goes out. I've had constant plumbing issues in my house and, it's $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 at a time, right? Okay. Most people can't afford that. Okay. That's the outcome. Okay. That's what we need to focus on. President Trump not taking a step back. The other thing that he's pointing out that is going to be the case is that oil prices are already coming down. We're seeing that across the board. Interest rates, he say, are coming down. I think that is somewhat subjective. He does say the slow-moving Fed should cut rates. It's not necessarily the president's job to say that, but we know about Jerome Powell. Jerome Powell, the Federal Reserve Chairman here in the United States, he was slow to raise rates in the face of inflation. In fact, I think you could lay some of the inflation at his feet. When COVID-19 happened, they understandably dropped rates basically to zero. But in hindsight, when the government stimulus came on, they actually just started raising rates. When the PPP checks were going out, when the unemployment checks started going out, what they probably should have done was raise rates. They didn't do that. They left rates low for too long. Some people blame, President Biden for passing a spending bill. I don't necessarily put the blame there. He got elected to do something. He put something together. Congress passed it. And, again, we can sit here and argue about the bill that Joe Biden put together and passed, the Inflation Reduction Act, or we can just focus on the outcome. And the outcome was the Fed should have raised rates way sooner than it did. They kept saying inflation was, quote, transitory, and it just simply wasn't. But the president doubling down on his tariff tough talk, and that's exactly what I said he was going to do. I think Trump rides this out. I said this on Sunday night, and I said I think he digs his heels in, and that's what he did. Again, some of you are going to want to say, well, the president shouldn't do this, he shouldn't do that. Look, you don't have any control over that, and what you should focus on is the outcome. If the president digs his heels in, which I think he gave you clear indication that he did, well, then that's going to create an outcome. That's what you need to focus on, okay? President Trump digs his heels in, whether you agree with it or not, is completely irrelevant. What the outcome is companies are going to have to start to adjust. And here's what Apple did. This crossed right before I sat down and started to record. And Apple is sourcing more of their iPhones from India to try to bypass tariffs. So basically what they're trying to do is ramp up production in India, which I would assume probably comes to the table with the president and works out tariffs. Maybe they're reduced, maybe they're not. But I tell you what, with these reports, the other thing that you need to do is read between the headlines, and not a lot of people are connecting enough dots as it relates to these tariffs, including a Wall Street Journal report that says that if the iPhone continues to be made in China and it suffers the tariffs, that it would cost maybe $1,500. What that's not assuming is any price concessions on the supplier side. I want you to take yourself out of the American consumer with a 401k and a $1,000 iPhone and probably a nice car and a $5 cup of coffee that you can comfortably afford. Put yourself into the factory owner or the factory investor in China, where you are pumping out a component that goes into the iPhone, and your entire existence actually depends on pumping out a component that goes into an iPhone. There's hundreds of these factories across China where they're making one of the little individual parts as it relates to going into the iPhone. And now, obviously, that component part is subject to a tariff when the final bill of goods is totaled up and that item is imported into the United States. Could be 500%, could be 50%. We'll talk about it here in a minute, but Trump ratcheting up the tensions and ratcheting up the additional 50% tariffs on China. That obviously impacts goods that are made in China. But one thing that could happen is that the suppliers actually reduced their price. And instead of having margins at 5, 10, 15, 20%, they obviously make margins much, much lower. And at the threat of potentially not selling anything, it is actually pretty common in manufacturing, instead of getting stuck with the goods, that you dump them off at a loss. Why would you just throw the goods into the trash if you can recoup some money for that? And so Apple is putting out these reports. I believe this report is put out intentionally by Apple to do two things. Number one, show that they are working at some stuff and they are behind the scenes working on this tariff situation. Number two, it's to put pressure on Chinese suppliers to lower their cost. If they lower their cost and absorb some of the price increases as it relates to the tariff, well, instead of the iPhone costing $1,500, maybe it only cost, and I say only, but maybe $1,200. And then here in the United States, who ends up selling you the phone most of the time? Oh, well, it's AT&T and Verizon. And AT&T and Verizon subsidize the price of the phone in order to get you to sign up, because they know if they lock you into some kind of contract or lock you into a cell phone plan, they know the long-term value of you renewing every month, month after month in their AT&T or Verizon or T-Mobile plan. So the game that the carriers play here is they dangle a free phone or a discounted phone in front of your face in order to make it up on the back end. So you could have dramatically increased subsidies for phones here in the United States. The other thing which is being pointed out is that President Trump in his first administration worked out carve-outs for iPhones and those types of things here in the United States so that phones were not subject to those types of tariffs. So this is a very, very fluid situation. Again, you can see and read that the president is going to dig his heels in. About 60 to 70% of the people are going to critique what the president said, how he said it, how it's stupid, how it's moronic, and all those types of things. The 1% investor actually starts to look at the outcome. And you say, well, Apple could shift to India. That is certainly a viable thing, probably not for 100% production, but I believe currently Apple is doing maybe about 25% of their iPhone production in India, or 25% of their goods. Maybe they can ratchet that up. Maybe you could accelerate that a little bit and get to 30, 40%. It's probably better for Apple in the long run in order to diversify the supply chains, and then they can work out some other things. I don't know if you can make these devices here in the United States. The technology is probably not there yet, but further investment from Apple there. There are reports, and I've talked about this multiple times, is you do have Chinese companies that are already setting up what are known as dark factories, including a cell phone company in China that reportedly has a dark factory that only cost, I think it was like $350 or maybe it was $400 million to set up. And this thing can pump out phones every second. And so these phones already today are being put together by robotics machines. Now, Apple needs to procure these machines, needs to develop this. It's certainly not going to be ready for the next iPhone, but this is something, a company with billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of cash, and also access to hundreds of billions of dollars more in the corporate debt market. They would just toss money and throw Apple money. They could also raise money through issuing the stock. The company has bought back a number of shares over the past couple of years. The company could issue those shares into the marketplace. Apple could raise just about any sum of money that it wants. And if it has competitors in the Chinese market that are already making phones using dark factories and robotics, well, there's no excuse and there's no reason why Apple can't do it as well. Now, as it relates to kind of the more macro environment and as it relates to how these other countries are going to respond to President Trump, again, I believe he's going to dig his heels in, and he supported that argument through a series of tweets today, and I think he's going to emphasize this over the next, probably the next several weeks. So now the question is, how do other countries respond? And I think the answer is relatively simple. When you look across the board, when you look across the global landscape, the vast majority of countries want access to the United States marketplace because you have the most affluent and most willing to spend consumers here. Remember, we have consumers here in the United States that barely have any money in their bank account, that can't afford a $1,000 or $2,000 emergency expense. But by God, when the iPhone comes out or a pair of Nikes comes out, or if there's a vacation or a spring break in Cabo, they're the first ones to leverage that and figure out a way to pay for that. In other countries, you're putting that money under your mattress. You're putting that money away for a rainy day fund. We don't do that in this country. In fact, we've trained kids for the past decade or two to go to college and borrow ungodly amounts of sums to get a college degree. Okay, among other things, the whole real estate market in the United States revolves primarily around borrowing money to buy a house that you can't afford, and you constantly do that. And then we're going to have a refi market coming up, probably later this year. The refi market, as interest rates continue to drop, you're going to have, thousands, tens of thousands of consumers that will refi, not at a lower rate, they will refi at the higher rate. Okay, I get solicitations from banks every single day in my mail where it's like, your house is worth this, you refi, you pull the money out, you do this and that, and that's not going to work on me. I'm not refining, I'm not taking out a HELOC or any of those types of things on my home, but a good percentage, there's going to be a wide percentage of people that will do that. They'll have equity in their home and they'll pull it out. And so this is what's going to happen. And so obviously, if you make goods in any of these other countries, whether it's Vietnam, whether it's Taiwan, whether, Mexico, Canada, any of these other countries, you're going to want access to that market. So according to the administration, over 50, and this should come as no surprise. Again, a lot of people are focused on what the president says, what he does, how he says it, how he was at a golf event this weekend, and, the optics are terrible. There's no excuse. The optics are terrible, the way Trump and his cabinet are presenting this. But again, the political brain, the CNN brain, the MSNBC brain, the Fox News brain as it relates to what Joe Biden did, they're going to focus on that. Focus on the outcome. The outcome is all of these countries realize that selling into the United States is the primary way to sell your goods. And if a tariff in place, whether it's a 5% tariff, 10% tariff, 15% tariff, whatever tariff is in place, it behoves that government, and it's in the best interest of that government, because it's really the government making the decision. And I'm certainly not an expert on Taiwan politics or Vietnam politics or Mexican politics or whatever, but I can imagine that if some of these countries play hardball with America, and then all of a sudden the factories and the manufacturers in your country don't have access to the United States market, well, boy, that would probably trigger a lot of poor economic outcomes in countries like Mexico. In fact, there's great research out there already, and this is one of the reasons why Mexico has not suffered over the past week, and Trump hasn't ratcheted up the tensions over in Mexico, because the Mexican president initially, when Trump was laying on those fentanyl tariffs on Canada and Mexico, Mexico wanted to play hardball. But they quickly realized that if you do that, the Mexican economy, I think, exports about 30% of their total exports to the United States. So if you all of a sudden lose access to a market where 30% of your exports are going, then, Mexico would go into a depression. And that's not, according to me, many other economic research. So when this news started happening, I was like, okay, what would happen to Mexico if they play hardball? Again, I focused on what the outcome was. I wasn't focused necessarily on what the Mexican president was going to say or how Trump handled these types of things. Doesn't really matter. What was the outcome? If Mexico wanted to play hardball and didn't want to export goods to the United States, the 100% consensus was they would go into depression, not a recession, a depression. And Canada's kind of in a similar boat. And so Canada's, the leaders of Canada are talking tough. I can't control what they say or what they do. The outcome is, if they don't want to play ball with the United States, then Canada will likely go into a pretty serious recession. The same is true for many, many, many other nations around the world. Taiwan, Vietnam, these countries, they need the United States consumer. You can't replace the United States, because I don't know, and this may be just me being completely ignorant. You can correct me if I'm wrong here. I don't know many countries that exist where the citizen, instead of saving up for a $2,000 emergency expense, would much rather have $2,000 to go on a Cabo vacation, $2,000 to spend on some Nikes, $2,000 to spend on, some Apple iPhone or something like that. That's the mindset of the consumer here in the United States. Instead of having emergency savings, we're having emergency trips to Cabo. Instead of having emergency savings, we've got the brand new iPhone, which was exactly the same as the previous one. That's the mindset of the American consumer, and it doesn't surprise me that you have 50 countries that have responded positively to President Trump. Now, going back to how President Trump is handling this, it appears that he doesn't want to do these deals over the phone. He wants to waltz you into the White House, almost walk of shame style, and have you negotiate this stuff in person. And so again, we could focus on how Trump is going to do this, but the outcome of that is to likely delay this and stretch this on for a period of time. But the outcome could be really interesting for the United States. If you can get a contortion of, I don't know if it's 50 countries, but let's assume some of the key trading partners, some of the partners that produce goods that are widely used here in America, like Vietnam in terms of textiles and other equipment, electronics and stuff like that, they'd be a great trading partner, right? What if you get Taiwan and their semiconductor business not only to continue to manufacture in Taiwan, but what if you get them to continue to invest like TSM is doing here in America? They've just recently partnered with Intel. What if you get some of these very key nations? And obviously you bring in Canada and Mexico, and I'll talk about the EU here separately. But what if you get this coalition of countries that all of a sudden do agree to kind of free trade? That is interesting. Okay, that is interesting. And if you can get to that point with President Trump, we'll see what happens. We'll see if he's able to get to that. Now, in terms of what people are saying and other nations are saying, I would say the two most important are the European Union, which obviously represents several, kind of a region of Europe, is what we consider Europe. It's very important that they get on board here and they don't get left on an island. And I'll talk about China here in a second. I think China and the EU run the risk, and I talked about this on my newsletter that I sent out on Sunday, that both countries run the risk of letting themselves and setting themselves out on an island. And China exports about 15%, 15% of their exports go to the United States. For the EU, it's actually 20%. Now, it depends on if you factor in service exports and all those types of things. But for the EU, that's significant. Okay, that's a significant number of their exports coming here to the United States. So in my opinion, the outcome for the EU would be to cut a deal. And it does appear that the EU president is saying that they are ready to negotiate with the United States and that they've offered 0 for 0 tariffs for industrial goods. It's interesting that they frame that among industrial goods. Trump's probably trying to go 0 for 0 across the board. And, EU's initial offer is for maybe industrial goods, and because they're always ready for a good deal. So here's what I would watch very closely, certainly over the next couple of weeks. Honestly, I would turn off the heat map. There's people like following this stuff tick for tick, what it does during the day, what it does over the next hour, and those types of things. It doesn't really matter. If you weren't going to sell your Google stock or your Microsoft stock next week, next month, it honestly doesn't matter if it goes up or down. In fact, you really want it to continue to go lower, particularly if you believe in these countries or these companies in the long term. So you actually want this drama to continue to play out more and more. And that's what I'm seeing when I'm posting content. And I'm seeing people angry and upset, and they're, clearly they've kind of lost their cool, so to speak. I am as cool as cucumber over here. As stocks go down, this is like the Rolex dealer saying, well, instead of $15,000 for the Daytona watch that you want, now it's $12,000. Why would I be angry? Why would I be angry with that at all? When I go to the grocery store and I actually start to see lower prices on stuff, I remember like lettuce was like $3.99. Now I go up there, it's $2.99. I'm not standing in the vegetable aisle, upset and firing off tweets and why are the prices lower? Once you change the 1% change their mindset. They look at stocks and they look at it just like a Rolex watch. They look at it just like their house. They look at it just like all of these things. If the price goes lower, it's actually better for you. Now, if you're 65, 70 years old, you should have rotated out of this stuff already. You don't need me Monday morning quarterbacking your portfolio. But the long-term investor, you should want these stock prices to collapse and go lower, as low as they possibly could go. In fact, the fact that stocks didn't go down more today, I'm actually a little bummed about that. But it's because we have positive progress. You have all these nations which would likely slip into a major recession, maybe even to depression if they didn't have access to the United States market, access to consumers that instead of saving $2,000 for emergency expense would much rather spend it on a vacation or some clothes or whatever. It's a great market to sell into. And 50 countries around the world likely agree to this and recognize this. And many, including Taiwan, Israel, Vietnam, have come to the table with kind of a loose offer. Now, they're probably going to have to fly here to the United States, and that's what's going to play out over the next probably several weeks. The EU is also making an offer. Now, what's different, though, is now you have China. China could potentially be put on an island. And it will be different than the island that they were on during COVID. Because as you recall, COVID happened, obviously, and it really tightened up and locked up some supply chains over in China. It didn't necessarily have to do, there were some tensions at the time between China and the United States. And obviously President Trump was president then as well. And so there were some tensions there, but they've been ratcheted up a little bit higher. The problem was getting the goods out of China because China had pretty intense, what we call here in America, lockdowns. And so they had very, very intense COVID measures. And we probably don't need to necessarily get into those, but more or less that those had a big effect. Again, focus more on the outcome rather than your personal opinion about lockdowns, your personal opinions about vaccines and those types of things. The outcome in China was that it locked down the ability to export out of the country. It was more that than the tariffs that were a little more targeted by the Trump administration in his first term during COVID. And so obviously we saw the price of things begin to rise, and supplies of computer chips and those types of things started to diminish during that era. And this is different though, with Trump saying, hey, we're going to put some tariffs on your goods. So China had a large reciprocal tariff. I think it was about 50% on top of the existing tariffs. China responded almost immediately and said, we're going to slap a 34% retaliatory tariff on U.S. goods. So China said, no, we're not going to deal with you, Trump. In fact, we're going to slap a bigger tariff. I think they also reduced some access to key minerals and those types of things. And so China wants to play hardball with the United States. They're digging in their heels, and President Trump at the same time is digging in his heels. And he threatened an additional 50% tariff on China. In fact, that goes into effect this week, which would effectively put the tariffs on most goods coming from China, ones that weren't exempt, like pharmaceutical products and others, it would effectively put the tariff at over 100%. So obviously making anything, almost anything, I don't want to exaggerate there, almost any product coming from China, exported into the United States with 100% tariff, would immediately not be competitive in the marketplace. I don't care if the good's made here in the United States or anywhere in the world, it would immediately make that good not competitive. And so both of these countries are digging in. And could it be that President Trump knows that he potentially could do that? Now, we're going to get into the weeds a little bit economically as it relates to China. If you look at money supply, and not to go into an entire economic seminar here. I've given this talk many times as I teach economics to middle school students. We've talked a lot about inflation, a little bit less this year, but over the past couple of years, we talked a lot about inflation because it's been kind of the key thing on people's mind. It's the key thing, in fact, I think it was like one of the leading issues that people voted on over the past couple of years. So inflation has obviously been a big topic. What causes inflation is an increase in money supply. Okay. A tariff, those types of things, that's a price increase. Okay. A price increase is not inflation. Inflation is the purchasing power of your money going down over time. And I have great examples of this as it relates to candy bars and prices of soda pop. Not going to get into it now, but just understand the price of something going up is not inflation. Inflation is the purchasing power of your money going down. That's the textbook definition. Ask any economist. They'll tell you that's pretty much spot on. How that happens, how does the purchasing power of your money go down? How is it that a candy bar 20 years ago was 50 cents and now the exact same candy bar is $2.25? That's because there's a heck of a lot more of those quarters in circulation, and that is measured by money supply. If you look at the United States money supply, you had a dramatic increase during COVID as they pumped a ton of money into the economy here in the United States, and money supply, at least here in the United States, continues to head higher. This is why you continue to see a depreciation of your spending power. It's also the reason why you recognize it by prices going higher. This is why home prices are going higher. It's not necessarily that the value of the home is going up. It's that the dollars that purchase the house, the purchasing power of those dollars are getting less. $100,000 today is not $100,000 in 1970. There's way more of them. So it takes way more of them to buy a house. And so the same thing is happening in China. Interestingly enough, their money supply continues to go up. Here in the United States, we saw pretty rapid inflation. As you increase the money supply, people were dusting it off and spending it. I would go to Las Vegas. I'd be in Las Vegas. It'd be a Tuesday afternoon. And I'd be just like, getting up, scratching my head, walking down. And the darn place was like packed. Like there was like a conference or a rock star event or something happen. I couldn't believe it. I would often be there with my brother, and I would always turn to my brother, and my brother had lived in Las Vegas, and he's like, dude, I've never seen anything like this. We'd be there on random Tuesdays and Vegas would be popping, okay? It had to do with money printing, had to do with people had an excessive amount of money. And again, the American consumer, you have extra money in your pocket, you're going to go to the casino in Vegas, okay? That's just what they do. In China, it's a little bit different, okay? In China, they actually have to encourage the consumer to spend. In fact, President Xi over the weekend urged Chinese people to boost consumption. He's begging them, he's literally begging them, and fully unleash the consumption potential. And look, I'm not an expert in China, people there, but my guess is this is a societal thing. This is something that is, the president can say one thing, but your wallet and your family means another thing. If President Trump were to try to tell me how to parent my kids, I wouldn't listen to him. And I think this is a little bit of that. President Xi is urging Chinese people to boost consumption. One of the way they've been trying to boost consumption in China, you've seen this with electric vehicles. You're also seeing it with smartphones. There's a reason why Apple has seen dramatic declines in terms of their market share as it relates to iPhone. That is because the Chinese government is giving you cash, literally straight cash, to go buy a phone made by a domestic provider. That they're also doing that with electric vehicles. And so what this is doing, this is actually causing deflation. So here in the United States, we've been dealing with inflation, and inflation sounds bad. A lot of people, again, recognize it as prices going up, but actually inflation, the technical term, is actually the purchasing power of your money going down. In deflation, it's the reverse. It's that prices, at least the way the Chinese consumer recognize them, is that prices continue to go lower. Now, from the average consumer perspective, you think like, oh man, prices going down must be great. And in some cases, it's okay. Also with inflation, the fact that you have more money supply, I guarantee you, if you're an hourly worker, what you're making per hour now is certainly more than what you probably made 4, 5, 6 years ago. Okay. Now your purchasing power has declined along with that, but you do have more dollars in your pocket. Those dollars just go a lower amount, or those dollars can be spent on kind of a reduced basket of goods. In China, it's actually the opposite. And deflation is just as worrisome and a problem for a society. It reduces wages. It also can reduce consumption, because think about it. If the price of something, if you're anticipating the price of something going down, you're going to delay your purchase. Okay. Inflation, it's actually the opposite. If you think the price of homes is going to skyrocket next year, you're probably going to run out and go buy a home. Same thing in the stock market. If you presume that the price of Google is going to be a higher share price next year, you're going to want to buy Google today. But if the price of Google you think is going to go down, then you're not going to buy Google. And that is the position that China actually faces, is that most consumers believe that the price of goods are going to continue to go down. This is on top of the fact that China continues to expand its money supply. So a couple of things here, couple of ways to look at this is that if China has to sit on an island, if Donald Trump puts China in an island where the EU comes to the table with a tariff deal that's agreeable, that Taiwan comes to the table, and Vietnam comes to the table, and India, and all these countries, they work something out with the president. Whether it's over a week or 2 weeks or a month or however long it takes, they work something out. And if China wants to sit and play hardball with the president, China doesn't have, at least at the current time, the consumer base to absorb any of those goods. So what this means is you'll have factories in China that are sitting idle. That means workers aren't working. That means stuff isn't being produced. Just like inflation can lead to a recession, deflation probably can lead to a recession, potentially even faster. In fact, deflation, depending on what economists you listen to, deflation is actually a worse problem than inflation is. And on the flip side of that, if China's money supply continues to have to expand, if they have to continue to stimulate the goods, just like we did here in the United States, if they have to subsidize somebody buying an EV, subsidize the factories, put money into the economy, well, we know here in the United States, on the other end of that, at some point is inflation. And China cannot go through a period of inflation because then all of a sudden its goods all of a sudden do not remain competitive on the global stage. The reason why China is a manufacturing hub, or one of the reasons, is because it's cheap to make the stuff there. If you go through an inflationary period of China where the raw materials, the labor, all energy costs, all that stuff inflates, just like we've seen here in the United States, well, all of a sudden, well, maybe it's not cheap or as cheap to make the stuff in China. So these are the risks. This is the outcome that's potentially in China. And this is what they have to balance. And this is what's at stake over the next, whether it's weeks, months, potentially a year or two ahead in China. If they put themselves on the island, you cannot replace the United States consumer. And we'll ask this last question or answer this last question. I got a lot of feedback on X today, and it goes to the point of what I was just talking about. Shout out to Devin on X, and he said, and he asked us a great question, so I don't want to make it seem like I'm disrespecting here. I'm just bringing up a question that a lot of people have, and I'm explaining it to you the best way I know from at least an economic standpoint. It says, seems to me if I was China, I would be reaching out to the Canada, EU, and Mexico trying to get some sort of agreement where, nobody bends together. And he says, this is part of the problem I see with Trump taking on the entire country or all the countries at once. And so I would point to a couple of things here. Trump is taking on every country at once. But again, we can't focus on how he's doing it, why he's doing it. Should he do it this way? Should he do it that way? We're going to focus on the outcome here. We're going to focus on the outcome. And I think the most likely outcome is that every country is in it for themselves. And you're going to have about 50 countries, give or take some, but you're going to have some key countries inside of the 50. The Taiwans, the Vietnams, probably India, certainly Mexico, maybe Canada, others. They're going to want to have access to the United States market. They know that our market is better because when you look over in China, you have to stimulate the price of goods. In fact, you have a deflation problem there. So exporting goods into China is not good because by the time you make it, you put it on a boat, it goes to China, it makes its way onto the shelf there, the price is probably already dropped. And so you can't do that as a manufacturer. China's consumer is trained to kind of hunker down, not spend like you do here in America. So everybody realizes this. China get them on their best day where they're not talking propaganda and talking tough with Trump, which look, I totally respect the president of China talking tough. I don't think this is a bad negotiation strategy. Again, it's not for me to say. It's the outcome of this, but the outcome of this could be dire for the country in the shorter term, particularly if the other countries come and play ball. If you get the EU to play ball, I think you've got most of North America wanting to play ball, and you get key countries, including Taiwan, Vietnam, and others coming to play ball with the president, then working something out. That's incredibly dangerous island to be on if you're China. It's incredibly dangerous because their consumer does not spend here in the United States, and they're going to have a lot of factories sitting idle, a lot of people going out of work. And what is that going to cause China to do? Well, they're probably going to have to give out social nets. They're going to have to give out what we call here in America unemployment checks or stimulus checks and those types of things. And we know if you keep doing that, now, economically, you can probably dance around the inflation thing for a while, but eventually it does catch up. Eventually, the inflation thing just catches up. And in China, if you have a stretch of inflation there, it all of a sudden makes your manufacturing business not competitive with the rest of the world from a price perspective. Now you've lost it all. Lost it all economically. Not saying that China goes away or they're completely lost, but you lose some advantage economically there. So the dangerous game that they're playing, and no, I do not see other countries coming and playing ball with China because their consumer just isn't wealthy enough. Their consumer isn't willing to spend enough like they do here in the United States. I urge you guys to focus on what the outcome is in these policies. You're wasting your time wondering how the president should say this, how he should do this. He should do this. Bill Ackman, I mean, every other minute he's firing off a tweet saying that the president should do this, president do that. Maybe if you're in Bill Ackman's position, you have a lot of influence. Maybe you feel like that's something you can do. But the average Joe investor, you do not have that influence. You do not have that power, and it is not worth your time. I would focus in particularly over the next couple of weeks what these, quote, 50 countries decide to do, how many of them come to America, how many of them make progress in these types of things. Pay very close attention to what the EU does. If the president starts to say nice things about the EU or that they have a meeting set up, that is probably a very, very good sign. And then on top of that, if he continues to ratchet up the tension on China, it's how China reacts. Initially, they're talking tough. They're urging the Chinese people to boost consumption because President Xi is no dummy. He realizes that if they lose some access to the American market, that consumer is not replaced dollar for dollar in the country of China. And on top of that, you will have lots of goods, lots of factories sitting idle. The other thing that I will point out is a lot of these goods that are made in China will get dumped into the marketplace. They'll make their way over to Vietnam. The Made in China sticker will be ripped off and the Made in Vietnam sticker will be put on, and it'll be imported into America at a 0% tariff. A lot of the cheap goods, now this is not going to happen with Chinese EVs or Chinese steel or Chinese, higher ticket stuff, but everybody's all worried about the cheap plastic garbage that you buy from China. It is still going to make its way into America, and it's probably actually going to make its way into America at a lower price because these manufacturers are going to have to dump the product off. If you are sitting on product, stuffed animals, pens, toys, whatever it is, you are not going to just let that sit in a factory. It was not made for the Chinese consumer. The Chinese consumer doesn't want it. So it is going to make it into the market one way or another. And what China often does in those scenarios is they dump it into the market, dump it at very, very low prices. The manufacturer probably took a loss at that case, and that is what's going to happen. The other thing that you're not going to see a lot of people cover is a lot of Apple suppliers are going to be making concessions on the price side. If the little piece or the case of this iPod or whatever these things are called, the AirBuds or whatever, if the case is costing Apple $20, well, Apple's going to go to them and say, look, buddy, we've got a 54% tariff or 100% tariff, from our president. How much lower can you go on this price? And you'd be surprised for a factory that only exists to make this, to export it to the United States, how quickly they'll figure out a way to come up with price concessions. Now, Apple is an extreme example. They have very high tolerance and very high quality products. When we go to the low end of, the trash can or the rake or whatever you're buying from China, what's going to happen is the quality is just going to get even worse. And so you're going to use cheaper paints. You're going to use cheaper materials. Instead of being 1 millimeter thick, you're going to be a 0.5 millimeter thick. They're just going to cut. And that's what's going to happen if China's president just doesn't come to the table and play ball. And that's the two things I would watch for certainly over this next week. How the EU reacts, and they've already given us an indication that they're ready to negotiate. They're going to have to fly here to America, likely to pull that off. And then if President Xi walks some things back, not expecting him to do that, and if he doesn't, the outcome will be extraordinary in the country of China. If they start to walk things back in China and the two countries, the United States and China can come together, you are going to see a V-shaped recovery in the stock market, and any stocks that are lower on the year will likely finish much, much higher almost immediately after those negotiations start to take place. But in the meantime, you've got leaders, particularly here in the United States, Trump digging his heels in, just like I said on Sunday, he was going to dig his heels in. And now you're waiting for the outcome. If the 50 countries can come together along with the EU, that is very powerful and not necessarily create a V-shaped recovery in the stock market, but that should be good enough to get stocks rolling here in the United States. If you get China on board, at least from a negotiation standpoint, delaying the tariffs, agreeing to meet at a later date, and then you pause these things, you'll have an even more violent reaction to the upside in the stock market. I think there's enough news on the table that with these 50 countries and the EU, there's enough incentive for both of these countries or all these countries to come to the table with Trump that you should be actively, very actively buying these stocks. And if you're scared and if you don't know what to do, it's called get out of managing your portfolio. You're not man enough. You're not woman enough, and you need to put your big boy pants on in these moments and make these tough decisions. Stop whining about what the president is saying. Stop whining about the things that you can't control and start worrying about the outcome. If the EU and 50 other countries come to the table with the president, all these stocks will perform very well. If China eventually comes to the table, then these things are going to skyrocket. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed today's podcast. We'll be back again another time. Good luck with your investments.